Hello, my name is Laura Quigg. Welcome to the League of Women Voters of New York City Census webinar. I'm now going to share my screen. The webinar today discusses the topic of how to complete or revise your census responses if you left New York City temporarily. My name is Laura Quigg. I'm a co-chair of the Census and Redistricting Committee of the League of Women Voters of the City of New York. Here's our website. The problem that I am going to address today is that a lot of people who normally live in New York City left town and either did not respond to Census 2020 at all, or they incorrectly responded using their weekend or seasonal home. If these New York City residents do not fix their census forms, our city will lose out. We'll lose money and we'll lose representation. There is a companion piece to this webinar. It is on our website. It's got a similar name and it's under Census 2020 and also under Toolkit Census 2020. And we'll repeat this page at the end of the talk so you can see it then. League of Women Voters. We are 100 years old. We were formed as an outcrop to women's suffrage, and the idea was to educate and advocate for major public policy issues and to educate and inform voters so that the newly enfranchised women could vote in an educated and informed manner. We also, the issues that we represent are fair representation, being counted, like the census, like anti-gerrymandering. In addition, things like immigration, education, healthcare, the environment, voter access, and reform. We are nonpartisan. That means that we don't support any party or elected official or candidate. So as many people know, a lot of people left New York City, not necessarily by boat, but they left when COVID started in March and April. This picture here is from March. It is looking west on 42nd Street from 3rd Avenue. It was a very sad time. So I took the picture myself. I remember it well. Maybe you or your friends or family went to something like this. You went to the mountains, you went to the beach, you went to your seasonal home. And some of you perhaps counted yourself in the census there, which is wrong if you plan to come back. So if you come back to the lovely Rainbow and the East River, Roosevelt Island, or to the newly opened outdoor cafes, this webinar is for you, and we will give you some instructions for how to proceed with the census. You should respond to Census 2020 based on your usual residence. Your usual residence may not necessarily be where you were on April 1st, 2020. If you already responded mistakenly that this is a temporary home was your residence, then you can still make the correction. It is not too late. New York City badly needs the money and the representation allocated based on the census. The many people who left town and didn't respond to the census based on their usual residence in New York City are depriving the Big Apple of those resources, money for hospitals and schools and many other things. Census response rates for New York City, especially Manhattan, are down considerably compared to 2010 in part because of this undercount. I mean, throughout the city, they're very low. It's just the contrast to 2010 for Manhattan is particularly low, but that's, we need help across all 5 boroughs in the city. Okay, so first I will go through the rules because they can be confusing, and I would not expect, or we do not expect, anybody to trust us. I mean, you should have the references for where it says in the census documents that you're responding the way you should be. So the Census 2020 document that starts off the basics is called 2020 Census, Where to Count Yourself If You Haven't Responded Yet. This is an incomplete title as it also covers where to count yourself, period. You can also correct your responses if you have responded already. So where I'm referring to the Census Bureau websites and documents, I've got it boxed in. So, and these are screenshots from those websites and resources. The document states that if you haven't responded yet, you can respond by, or you want to change a response, you can respond to the census at 2020census.gov by phone or by mail. You should respond for the address of your usual residence, which is the place where you live and sleep most of the time as of April 1st, 2020, even if you were temporarily staying somewhere else on April 1st, 2020. Oops. They are clear in this document that you should count yourself at your usual residence, and we'll refer back to this page. So from this document, it says, here are some possible scenarios where you would count yourself. The main one that we'll be talking about here is that you were temporarily staying somewhere on April 1st due to work, family, COVID-19, or another reason, but you plan to return to your usual residence. In this case, you should count yourself at your usual residence. Two other scenarios: if you were temporarily staying somewhere on April 1st, but you aren't sure if you'll return to your usual residence, then you should count yourself where you were staying on April 1st. If you move to a new residence, you should count yourself where you were living on April 1st. I will refer back to this, this page and repeat it. To correct an incorrect response, you can call the number for Census 2020 and speak to a human being after a few prompts. That's 844-330-2020, or fill out the online form. The Census Bureau will identify and correct duplicate responses. So in the Census Bureau FAQs, and this is also in the companion piece, so you can link to it and see what it says for yourself. So if you want to correct, if you need to correct a mistake on the online form, you can return to the online questionnaire and resubmit your information. The Census Bureau has procedures in place to resolve duplicate submissions. So also with the Census ID, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, if you've already responded using your Census ID, you select the link that reads, if you don't have your Census ID, click here and submit a corrected response for your address. So you can respond using your address in any case. Okay, so those are the rules. Now we'll go through the process. You are supposed to complete the census for all properties. For your usual residence, it's a little bit more straightforward. So we're talking about from the beginning part of this talk, more for this temporary residence, but we'll start it off, and it applies to both in the beginning. So you go to my2020census.gov, and you'll do this for each of your residents, and click on Start Questionnaire. So Start Questionnaire. If you don't know your 12-digit census ID, you can use your address. So in that case, you would click on, if you do not have your census ID, click here. The next page starts to ask about your address. I'll come back to this April 1st thing. So it will ask whether you were in a US state or the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, or somewhere else. So I'll start with Puerto Rico or somewhere else. And if the residence is in Puerto Rico or somewhere else. So in Puerto Rico, the next prompt incorporate the differences in the way the addresses are described there. You may have gone to a temporary residence in Puerto Rico, and so this is relevant to you. If your residence is somewhere else outside of a US state or DC, the next page states, if you are not living in a US state, District of Columbia, or Puerto Rico on April 1st, 2020, again, the date we'll refer back to, you do not need to complete this Census 2020 questionnaire. If you were living in American Samoa, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, Guam, or the US Virgin Islands on April 1st, 2020, an enumerator, that's a door knocker or physical person, will contact you to complete your questionnaire in person. So in those cases, you're still supposed to complete your census form, but it's not through this process. In that case, you may close the browser. So you're done for this temporary residence that's in that location. Okay, so if you answer a US state or District of Columbia, the next page is asking about your address. Okay. This page asks where you were living on April 1st, 2020, which isn't quite right. You are supposed to respond based on your usual residence, which is where you live and sleep most of the time, as we explained and documented above. So it says, where were you living on April 1st, 2020? Well, that's not quite right. So remember the rules. Rules refresher, coming back to it. So if you are temporarily staying somewhere on April 1st, but plan to return to your usual residence, you should count yourself at your usual residence. Okay. So for a property that you reside in only part of the time, not your usual residence, or that you move to temporarily, you answer the questions as follows. For the address, you fill in the address of this temporary home. You hit next, and then an address to review appears. It asks, please review your address. And you can click on help if you need help. It asks that all over the place. Here's the address that you submitted. If the address is correct, select submit. If you'd like to make changes, select revise. So throughout here, I entered in my own address, which I do not want to show. So I've got in green italics your address here, or your address would appear. So this is where your address would appear. So you enter, you revise or you submit, and you click on submit when you're done. Okay, next up, they ask for your name and phone number. The Census Bureau asks for this information in case they need to reach you in order to reconcile any information. It is used for operational purposes only. It is illegal for them to share any individual level information for 72 years, punishable by up to $250,000 of a fine or 5 years in jail. The other data collected may be used for statistical purposes only, just numbers, no individual information. So enter this information and then hit next. Okay, first they ask for household information, next for people questions. The household questions, you'll actually never get to the people questions for this temporary residence, but you will for your usual residence where you are meant to have household members there. So for household questions, it says at the top, including yourself, how many people were living or staying at your address. If this is a temporary home, not your usual residence, say that 0 people were living or staying there. But, oh no, look what comes up next. They call it a soft error. When I was researching how to do this, I spoke with our Census Bureau representative who trained us in our census committee at the League of Women Voters, and asked her what the process was, and she described a soft error, and I didn't know what she meant. But then when I went through actually filling out the census, I found out what it was. And so you get this red bar saying, please include yourself when reporting the number of people. They want to make sure that you're not saying it's people in addition to myself rather than just me and the rest of the people in my household. So don't be deterred. Stick with the 0 under the number of people in your household and hit next again. Then they ask about April 1st, 2020 again, but don't be dismayed. Yes, on April 1st, 2020, were you living or staying at your address? You say no if that residence was not your usual residence and you plan to return to your usual residence, even if you were physically living in this temporary home on April 1st, 2020. Remember the rules we laid out earlier. Rules refresher. So same thing. If you plan to return to your usual residence but were temporarily staying somewhere else, on April 1st, you should count yourself at your usual residence. Back to the questions. On April 1st, 2020, were you living or staying at your address? If you say no, as you should, if it was not your usual residence, next up is, what is the primary reason why no one was living or staying at your address? So you see now it's starting to make a little bit of sense. Because they have these categories that seems to include the ones that we're primarily talking about here. But again, they're doing this April 1st thing that you should think of as your usual residence. It's, so you weren't staying at this temporary one, you were staying at your usual one was somewhere else. So for the purposes described here, you should click on the box for seasonal, recreational, or occasional use. You select it and hit next. Then they say, thank you, and ask if you live somewhere else. So thank you for providing information for that address. Since you did not live or stay at this address on census day, you do not need to provide any additional information for it. Sorry about the change of font. Do you have another census ID for the place that you were living in or staying on April 1st, 2020? So here is where you should respond correctly about your usual residence, which may be in New York City. You should say yes, either to correct your census response or to respond to for the first time. If you already filled it out for your usual residence with your complete members of household, then you're done. But for the moment, let's say that you haven't. In that case, you should say yes, and you should say yes whether or not you have the ID, because same as before, you can use the address. So you hit next, and then it will give you a screen that starts the process again. So here you should respond to the census for your usual residence in New York City to correct an incorrect form or to respond for the first time. If you don't have your census ID, you can use your address. Where you entered 0 before for your total household size at your temporary residence, now you enter your total number of members in your household and you answer questions about them. So that would be more individual members of the household. We hope that you will take the time and effort to respond to the census based on your New York City address if it is your usual residence. Responses from the census help determine how billions of dollars, some estimate more than $1 trillion in federal funds, are allocated for critical public services for the next 10 years. It determines our representation in Congress, the Electoral College, and many other offices more locally. New York State currently has 27 House seats. After the 2020 census, it is expected that we will lose 1 or 2 seats in Congress. We're almost surely going to lose 1. And what determines if we go down to 26 or 25 is a very hair trigger kind of decision. So it could actually be a very few number of responses that determines whether we lose 1 seat or 2 seats, whether we have 25 or 26 House seats. And that also affects the Electoral College votes that we have. So please contribute to your city and to your state in this small way. 2020 census, you count everyone once, only once in the right place. So don't go missing, be there. Census 2020 locks in population for 10 years. A decade is a really long time. This is the companion piece available at the League website under Census 2020 and Toolkits, Census 2020. League of Women Voters of the City of New York, please join us, donate, and volunteer. Thank you all for being part of this webinar. If you have any questions, go to the website and contact the office. Thank you.